Welcome to my analysis of The Cow in Apple Time by Robert Frost. Firstly, let's go through what the poem is about. It describes a cow who is tempted by fallen apples and decides to break out of her field and eat those instead of grass. They are delicious and she quickly becomes drunkenly infatuated. However, they make her ill and she yells out in pain as her udder dries up and she becomes useless livestock. So this covers the idea of too much of a good thing and of addiction and greed. And it covers it from the perspective of the individual being at fault and the temptations themselves being neutral. Now, I think this is quite interesting because often when we talk about addiction and greed in things like alcohol, we often place the blame on the substance itself, whereas this poem doesn't do that. However, it is hopeful because greed is not seen to be an inherent trait in all beings, but instead it just needs to be treated with self-regulation. Now let's analyse the poem line by line. Something inspires the only cow of late to make no more of a wall than an open gate, and think no more of wall builders than fools. Immediately there is a parallel in this first line with another of Frost's poems, Mending Wall. Now, it will be useful for this analysis if you have read Mending Wall and you're familiar with it, because there are a lot of ways that this poem is similar to that one, and I'm going to be referring back to it a couple of times throughout the analysis. But yes, it starts on the word something, which is the same word that Mending Wall starts on, and like Mending Wall, it gives this sense of mystery, but it also pins down the focus on this mystery, because there's always an emphasis on the first line of the poem. For obvious reasons, it's the first word that you see. So this lets us know that the subject of the poem is going to be about the something that is inspiring the cow. That's what we're going to be discussing and what we're going to be getting to the root of throughout the poem. Another thing that alludes to Mending Wall is the mention of the wall builders. Inspires is another interesting choice of words because it has connotations of ambition, when cows are usually seen as placid. So I think this shows what addiction can do to you and how it can change you, and how when you're so tempted by something sweet and interesting, it can make you do things that you wouldn't normally do. It also might add a sense of comedy, because we don't usually think of cows being inspired, and it's quite a funny concept to think of. The repetition of no more emphasises the disrespect and the blatant rule breaking at play. I would say as a general rule of thumb, repetition equals emphasis of whatever concept those words are referring to. Then the cow is also referred to as the only cow of late, and that implies that many cows have gone through this same phase of being rebellious. Her face is flecked with pomace, and she drools a cider syrup. Having tasted fruit, she scorns a pasture withering to the root. Pomace is the solid remains of fruit after pressing juice or oil from it, and drooling is really good imagery in my opinion because it creates an instant picture of gluttony. It also has connotations of being childish or drunken and foolish. Cider syrup is again great diction. There's such great diction in this poem. Obviously cider gives the idea of alcohol and drunkenness, and syrup is sweet and delicious, but it's also unhealthy. So I think this is really clever because Frost could have just said she drools apple juice, but he uses these words that have particular connotations in our head to get across the ideas of the poem really clearly. Then there is the cow scorning the pasture, and that comes across as quite an arrogant thing to do, which keys into her greed and selfishness. She runs from tree to tree where lie and sweeten the windfalls spiked with stubble and worm-eaten. She leaves them bitten when she has to fly. The word runs here plays even more into the idea of greed, because obviously runs has connotations of being hasty and maybe even being desperate. Then the words lie and windfalls key us into the fact that these are rotting apples on the floor, but the interesting thing is that they are initially described in positive ways. So the word windfall is usually used to describe gold or gifts or treasures, and sweeten is obviously a positive word. And this juxtaposes the next line, which reveals that the reality is unappealing. The apples have stubble on them and they're worm-eaten, which has connotations of death and decay. When the cow has to fly, that means that she's feeling sick and she has to get out of there. And another interesting thing to notice here is that it's written in present tense. And I think this, as I mentioned at the beginning of the poem, gives the idea that this is a regular occurrence. So not only is it happening to multiple cows, but it actually happens to the same cow over and over. She's always leaving them bitten when she has to fly. She bellows on a knoll against the sky. Her udder shrivels and the milk goes dry. Bellows is onomatopoeia, and it really emphasizes the way that the cow is in serious pain because the apples have started fermenting in her stomach. A knoll is a small hill, and I think the most interesting words used in this section of the poem is against the sky. So this could mean two things. It could be that the cow is in opposition to the sky and she's blaming the sky for her pain. And this shows how powerless and insignificant she is, because obviously a cow against the entire sky isn't a very equal fight. And that presents the message that no matter how much she wants the apples, she can't change the fact that they're not good for her and she shouldn't be eating them. Alternatively, the phrase against the sky could be referring to her silhouette being projected against the sky, which creates a very dramatic image and a dramatic ending. And I think this is for comic value because it is a pretty ridiculous image of a cow with stomach pains on a hill. So it's not exactly what you think about when you think about a high drama scene. Moving on, we're going to break down the form of this poem. So the rhyming scheme is an AABB rhyming scheme, but this is disrupted at the end by a triple rhyme, AAA. And this reflects the regular schedule of how cows must be milked at the same time each day, otherwise their udders dry up. And the disruption of the rhyming scheme at the end mirrors the way that the cow has brought pain upon herself by disrupting the order of how she should eat and then produce milk. Now, because this is a short poem and it's quite a simple story, the most significant poetic technique for me is the careful selection of words with complex connotations, which bring emotional layers to the piece. So I'm going to give some examples of this. One is the word windfalls, which is usually used to describe gold or treasure, but here it is describing the fallen apples and presenting how the cow sees them as gifts. This is undercut in the next line by the abandoned connotations of stubble and the disgusting idea of something being worm-eaten. Another example is cider syrup, which makes sure the reader gets the right idea of the cow's gluttony. It is drunken and unhealthy, but addictive and sweet. The narration is objective, and there is a repeated pronoun of she in lines 6 and 7 and at the start of lines 9 and 10. And this emphasizes that the addiction is entirely the cow's fault. This is unlike Mending Wall, and even more so, another Frost poem about boundaries called There Are Roughly Zones, which I've also made a video on, which they pin the fault on humanity and human nature, not necessarily on the greed of an individual. However, as this seems to happen so often and with different cows, it is definitely a tendency of them, but I get the impression that it isn't hardwired and simply requires some self-preservation, possibly because the cow is sort of made fun of and seen to be quite childish and like she just needs to learn to do better. So that's sort of reading in between the lines, but that's the message I get from the poem. Speaking of how she is made fun of, I think that Frost balances and contrasts really well the comedy of the cow's deluded fantasy and her ridiculous drunkenness with the unattractive consequences of reality. In this way, he can display both the temporary fun of sweet treats, but also the crushing regret afterwards. So it's quite polarizing themes, but both are displayed really vividly, even in this very short poem. Now, our last section I'm not really sure what to name this, but we're just going to go with, what is this poem about then? What is it describing? What is it talking about? What does it mean? So this would usually be where I talk about the themes of the poem, but I think there's only really one theme in this poem, and that is the theme of too much of a good thing, and things not always being as good as they first appear. And the poem is therefore advocating self-regulation and being aware of the consequences of crossing boundaries. It also could be describing the human failing to be satisfied with what you've got. This parallels the story of the Garden of Eden. Eve ate an apple just like the cow ate an apple. So the apples represent temptation, and submitting to temptation corrupts your innocence. And this especially seems to be what the poem is alluding to, because female pronouns are used and repeated quite a lot. Now, there's obviously a theme of boundaries in this poem, which mirrors Frost's fascination of boundaries, which he shows in his other poems, Mending Wall and There Are Roughly Zones. Like in Roughly Zones, it cautions against going outside your boundaries. Mending Wall is slightly different, because in Mending Wall, boundaries are arguably seen as unnecessary, except, the main character says, when there are cows. On one of the neighbours' sides of the wall, there is also apple trees, so there definitely seems to be some similarities between these two poems, and perhaps this poem is showing the validity of boundaries, showing how they actually are good when cows are there, and sort of just exploring that theme a little further. So this is definitely a good poem to read after you have read and examined Mending Wall. So I'm going to move on to sort of what the poem could be alluding to, possible interpretations of its meaning. So a famous cow, possibly the only famous cow, is Europa from Greek mythology. So the cow could actually be a metaphor for Europe, the continent, which was actually named after the mythological character Europa. So it could be talking about Europe overstepping its boundaries and being self-destructive on the global stage. And the fact that it was written in late 1914 gives an even heavier association with a part of Europe, namely Germany. So some people think that the cow represents Germany in this poem, and the apples are the countries it takes over. So thus, the message of the poem is that Germany will suffer a self-fulfilled punishment for their actions. So if we try to apply it to humans in general and countries in general, the fact that this seems to have happened so often, and with different cows, the cows succumbing to this temptation and being destructive, it does come across as a tendency. So perhaps Frost is saying that, often humans are power hungry or greedy for stuff that isn't really good for them, but they keep doing it anyway because it's addictive. However, the poem ends on a hopeful note, at least I think, because it seems to have the implication throughout that this isn't hardwired into the cow. Something is inspiring it. It doesn't just do it naturally. Not all the cows are doing it at the same time, at least. So it isn't hardwired into the cows, and in the same way, power hungriness, greed, whatever you think it is not hardwired into humans. And so the poem is basically just saying we all need to regulate ourselves a bit better, exercise self-control. And I think that's quite an empowering and hopeful message.